It's October 1775. The Americans have shocked and humiliated the British by defeating them at the battles of Lexington and Concord. The British have been forced to withdraw their army to the city of Boston. However, the Americans give chase and pursue them. Now, the American army lays siege to the city and holds the British troops contained therein. A few short months ago, the British achieved their first major victory in the war when they launched an audacious attack on Bunker Hill. Though the British defeated the Americans and were successful in taking the hill, the victory was Pyrrhic. The British took extremely high casualties and were now unable to enact the rest of their plan. As a result, the British are now contained in the city, unable to launch any offensive maneuvers and any attempts to break the siege. George Washington has just been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the American Army, and he's been sent to Boston to oversee the siege. Meanwhile, inside of the city, the commander who led the assault on Bunker Hill, General William Howe, has been promoted to Commander-in-Chief of British operations in the Americas. It's here the two commanders will face off in their first battle of the war. As October moves forward, the two armies settle in for what will be one of the most cold and brutal winters in American history. This is Grim Battalia, and you're watching my documentary on the American Revolution, The Battle for Boston, Part 2. If you want to see Part 1, The Battle for Bunker Hill, the link will be provided in the description below. As the winter worsened, morale began to decline amongst the Americans. American soldiers and militiamen began to freeze to death on guard duty, and many of the militia who had enlisted in fits of patriotism and emotion did not have freezing to death outside of the city of Boston in their mind when they joined the cause. As a result, desertion began to increase by the day as Americans departed the siege and headed home. Inside of the city, Americans were victimized by the British troops, and a mass exodus began of patriots flooding out of the city, launching a refugee crisis throughout New England. Meanwhile, throughout all the colonies, those still loyal to the king were harassed and victimized by the patriots. They began to flood the city of Boston for protection. They caused a crisis of homelessness and overcrowding. The overcrowding and the severe cold caused disease to spread throughout the city. An epidemic of smallpox began, and soldiers and civilians alike began dying in droves. General William Howe sought to use this to his advantage and to launch a biological attack against the Americans. He took sick patriots and he instructed them to depart the city and to make way to the American camps. However, Washington had learned of this plan, and despite feeling pity for the patriots, he had no choice but to tell his men to forbid them from making contact with them. Inside of the city of Boston, His Majesty's troops became restless and weary of the siege. The cold was just as bad for them as it was for the Americans. They began chopping down every tree in the territory that they controlled to use for firewood. When the British ran out of trees, they began ripping out the pews from churches and using the remains of homes destroyed during the siege to burn. The American siege, however, had one major flaw that made it rather ineffectual. The Americans lacked any control over the seas, and supplies continued to flow in from England to reinforce the troops in Boston. To counteract this, the Americans tried to enlist local privateers to harass the British naval force. However, these men were untrained in naval warfare and lacked any meaningful equipment. They were easily pushed back by the British forces and repelled, and the plan did not accomplish very much. George Washington was aware of how ineffectual the siege was, and he was aware that morale was dropping amongst his men. He began coming up with many audacious plots to break the siege and capture the city, which he proposed to his war council, which was comprised of many trusted generals and advisors. One such plan had the Americans crossing the frozen harbor and attacking the city from all sides. However, Washington's war council convinced him that this plan was unrealistic. The plan was overly complex, and his inexperienced and undisciplined militia would have a very hard time pulling it off in the way that was needed in order for it to achieve victory. Washington was famous for coming up with very complex strategies that required minute attention to detail in order to succeed. However, he is also credited because many times he would listen to his war council and co-opt these plans against what he felt was his better judgment. This ability to listen to others would often lead the army to victory. As the siege dragged through the winter, both sides turned their eyes towards an area known as Dorchester Heights. The heights overlooked the entire city of Boston and its harbor, and would be the perfect location for the Americans to shell the city from. Furthermore, if the Americans controlled the heights, they could close off the British shipping lane, thus isolating the city from the outside world. The British would then be forced to surrender as soon as food or morale finally ran out. However, fortifying the heights would not be an easy task. They were exposed from both sides and could be easily bombarded by any force who noticed the opposition was trying to make fortifications on the heights. General Howe would declare that the heights were absolutely necessary for the security of Boston, and that any attempts by the Americans to fortify the heights would be met with the full force of the British Army. Several months prior, the Americans had shocked the British when General Benedict Arnold led Americans in an attack on Fort Ticonderoga in the dead of night. The Americans were victorious, and the British surrendered without even putting up a fight. The Americans gained a bountiful supply of both artillery, ammunition, and small arms. In February 1776, Washington sent word to Colonel Knox at Fort Ticonderoga to send his artillery down to support the siege. This would be a complex operation, crossing over the frozen Hudson and many frozen Connecticut rivers. However, impressively, Colonel Henry Knox and his team of engineers were able to complete it in little over a month. Soon, the cannons reached the American position, and George Washington began to put his plan to finally capture the city and end the siege into action. Near to the area of Lamb's Dam, the Americans stacked hay all along the road so that they could move their men from Lamb's Dam to Dorchester Heights without being observed by the British forces. Washington then ordered that a heavy artillery bombardment begin. Prior to this, the Americans had only conducted limited shelling of the city, since many of their friends and family were still living there. However, the time to seize the city had come, and so the order was given. The bombardment continued for 2 days, and at nighttime, on March 6th, Washington put his plan into action. The 2 days of cannon firing had desensitized the British to the bombardment. They no longer expected any sort of infantry response from the Americans. When the British returned fire, they played right into Washington's hands. The sounds of the British cannons drowned out the noise of hundreds of American troops rushing towards Dorchester Heights. The men were hidden by the bales of hay which had been strategically placed along the road to hide their movement. Absolute silence is a must, since a sharp word could carry across the frozen water and into Boston. With the full moon giving them light, the Americans began cutting down the trees and preparing their fortifications and defenses. The Americans worked in waves, fortifying the position and building quick fortifications. They prepared barrels on top of the hill, filled with rocks and sand that can be rolled down on the enemy in case of a British attack. The Americans then silently moved their cannons into position and successfully seized control of the heights, without the British even becoming aware. The Americans had successfully captured the height unopposed. In the morning, they begin the day by bombarding the city of Boston from their new position. The British awaken to find the American fortifications on the hills. They immediately launch a bombardment, but find their cannons have little to no effect, as the heights are outside of their range. Howe recognizes that his position has become unsustainable. He's reported as saying, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than I could have made my army do in 3 months." With that, he signals to Washington that he's willing to surrender. He makes a deal with Washington. Howe will not burn down the city if he is allowed to evacuate in safety. Washington grants his requests, and the British board their ships and depart the city. With that, Washington and the Americans had claimed their first major victory in the war. The victory was just as important strategically as it was symbolically, as it convinced many Americans that victory was a real possibility. While it has been theorized that Washington could have cut off Howe and likely destroyed his army right now, it's important to remember that at this stage in the war the Declaration of Independence had not yet been signed, and many Americans still wished for reunification with the British Empire. However, in England, King George had very different things on his mind. All he wanted was revenge against the upstart and rebellious patriots. The Americans wouldn't have long to bask in their victory, as at this very moment, the king and his men plotted for a new invasion. This time, they would attack the city of New York. This was Grim Battalia. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe. Please let me know in the comments if you were General of Washington. Would you have allowed Howe to escape safely, or would you have attempted to crush his army here and now? As always, thank you for watching, and please never stop learning.